So now you know all about filtrate, that small molecules leave the glomerulus. So during that initial sorting, you're not sorting out by molecules you want to keep and molecules you want to get rid of. You're sorting by size. And many of those small molecules that left, you actually want to keep. So now you do reabsorption. This is where you move those molecules from the tubular fluid in the nephron back to the blood. So let's look at the picture and start labeling some things here. This area is the tubular fluid. Here is the blood. And in this scenario, the molecule we're going to move is glucose. So all these little green things here are glucose. So we have glucose in the tubular fluid, and we want to move it back into the blood. The blue things here are transport proteins. So to reabsorb glucose, you have transport proteins, in the proximal convoluted tubule will move the glucose from the tubular fluid to the blood. Okay, so that's reabsorption. Pretty simple idea. Now, with glucose, though, we do run into some issues if somebody has diabetes or the inability to regulate their blood glucose level. So you have Tmax. Tmax is the maximum amount of glucose that those transport proteins can move. Okay, so this would mean that the transport proteins are working as hard as they can and they're moving as much glucose as they can. In a typical human kidney, the Tmax for glucose is about 320 milligrams per minute. So if we come back up here and you imagine glucose, the tubular fluid is flowing through, these proteins have the ability to get 320 milligrams of glucose grabbed from the tubular fluid and sent back into the blood every minute. That is the Tmax, transport maximum. Okay, there's also the idea of renal threshold. This is the amount in the blood that corresponds to your Tmax. For glucose, that is 220 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so we have these two numbers. To understand them, think about if you had the amount of glucose in this water bottle is the threshold. So let's say this is a bottle of water and it has sugar in it. So renal threshold is the amount in the bottle. Okay. As we pour it out and it's flowing by, Tmax would be the amount of glucose we could grab out of there as it flows by. Let's put that in context with this picture. Remember the blood coming into the kidney. If the blood coming into the kidney has 220 milligrams of glucose per deciliter of blood, then you're going to have glucose here in the tubular fluid. And the amount of glucose that you have here in the tubular fluid flowing by will be 320 per minute. So if there's 220 milligrams per deciliter in your blood, that means that in 1 minute, 320 will flow through the proximal convoluted tubule. And that is how many your transport proteins, when working as fast as they can put back into your blood. So that means when you get to the urine, there will be 0 glucose because all of it went back into the blood. With diabetes, you get glucose in the urine. So let's think about someone who has diabetes. Here's the kidney, and we have dirty blood coming in. Let's suppose that this dirty blood coming in has 300 milligrams of glucose per deciliter. Okay, now remember, everything coming out of the kidney is either going to be clean blood or it's going to be urine. So the Tmax is 320 milligrams per minute, which corresponds to 220 milligrams per deciliter. So that means we have an extra 80 deciliters here that the transport proteins won't be able to get. So in the clean blood coming out, we will have 220 milligrams per deciliter. And in the urine going out will be the other 80 milligrams. Okay, let's do another scenario. Here's the kidney. You have the dirty blood coming in. Let's suppose that the dirty blood coming in has 420 milligrams per deciliter of glucose. In the clean blood coming out, it's going to be 220. The difference goes into the urine. So you would have 200 in the urine. Here's a video. Funny video. Enjoy this to help illustrate it.
I thought you were downstairs boxing chocolates. Oh, they kicked me out of there fast. Why? I kept pinching them to see what kind they were. This is the 4th department I've been in. Oh, I didn't do so well either. No.
All right, girls. Now, this is your last chance. If one piece of candy gets past you and into the packing room unwrapped, you're fired.
Yes, ma'am.
Let her roll!
was easier. Yeah, we can handle this okay. Listen, Ethel, I think this... I think we're fighting a losing game. Here she comes.
Fine, you're doing splendidly. Speed it up, Anna!
So hopefully you enjoyed that video clip, watching Lucy and Ethel in the chocolate factory. So that represents what happens in the kidneys if you have diabetes and you have high blood glucose. So in diabetes, you lack insulin or the cells don't respond to insulin. Remember this from chapter 17. So you have high glucose in the blood. So then when it goes through your kidneys, the glucose is a small molecule and it is filtered out. Then you have your transport proteins. They put the glucose back in the blood as it flows by. So they are like Lucy and Ethel. So Lucy and Ethel are the transport proteins. They're grabbing the glucose, they're putting them back into the blood. The chocolates are the glucose. Okay, and the conveyor belt is the tubular fluid flowing by. So, as long as the chocolates were going by slow, Lucy and Ethel could handle it. As long as your blood glucose is low, your transport proteins can get all of the glucose put back. But when the conveyor belt went too fast, Lucy and Ethel couldn't keep up and some of the chocolates got by them unwrapped. If blood glucose is high, your transport proteins can't get them all. And so some escape into the urine. So that's how diabetes causes glucose in the urine. Now let's look at our next thing we're going to reabsorb, and that is sodium and potassium. So if we start off with labeling, here is the tubular fluid. Here is the blood. The little pink molecules here are sodium, and the blue ones are potassium. So we need to control the movement of sodium and potassium. Right now, sodium and potassium are both in the tubular fluid. You also have some out here between the nephron and the blood. So we want to control these. You have this, your sodium-potassium pump, right here. Your sodium-potassium pump is what's going to move sodium and potassium. So your nephron has sodium-potassium pumps. Same pumps that we talked about back in chapter 12 with your neurons. And remember, it moves sodium and potassium in opposite directions. In your nephron, it's going to move sodium to the blood. So you will reabsorb sodium. Potassium goes in the opposite direction. So it moves potassium to the tubular fluid. So this is secretion. You're going to take it out of the blood and put it in the tubular fluid. So sodium is going this direction into the blood, and potassium is going this direction into the tubular fluid. So the effect of these sodium-potassium pumps is they reduce your blood potassium and they increase your blood sodium. Okay, now remember also that water is attracted to sodium. So when this sodium moves into your blood, water follows it. So water will be here following the sodium. So wherever the sodium goes, water follows, like Mary and her lamb. So these pumps also increase the amount of water in your blood. And that has the effect of reducing the amount of urine that you make, because water is moving from the tubular fluid back into the blood. So there'd be less water going to the urine. This is something you adjust. You don't always have the same number of pumps. It varies. And how many you have is controlled by aldosterone. The yellow dot here is aldosterone. This should sound familiar to you. We learned about it in chapter 20. It's a hormone from the adrenal cortex. The more aldosterone you have, the more sodium-potassium pumps you have. Okay. And aldosterone is a lipid-soluble hormone. So think back to chapter 17. Lipid-soluble hormones cross the cell membrane. So that's why aldosterone is here inside the cell. And they bind to a receptor in the cell, and they stimulate protein synthesis. And your sodium-potassium pump is a protein. So this is a lipid-soluble hormone that makes you have more of the protein sodium-potassium pumps. So let's think about the stimulus for aldosterone and the responses. So if the effect of aldosterone is lower blood potassium. That means that a stimulus is high blood potassium. So your adrenal cortex gland, let's go ahead and make this number 1, monitors your blood potassium level. If blood potassium is too high, it secretes aldosterone. The aldosterone will cause you to have more sodium-potassium pumps in your nephron. And they will move potassium from the blood. And you will lose this potassium in the urine. And the result of this is you reduce your blood potassium. So you get back to homeostasis. The problem was that it was too high. You lose it in the urine. Now you reduce it back to normal. Okay, so that's one thing that can stimulate you to have aldosterone. Think about what the other one would be. Another effect of aldosterone is that you increase your blood sodium. So what would be the stimulus that would cause you to need it? So your adrenal cortex gland monitors your blood sodium. And if it is too low, you get more aldosterone. This makes you have more sodium-potassium pumps. And you will move more sodium into the blood. And so the result is you increase your blood sodium. The third thing that can stimulate you to have aldosterone we learned in chapter 20. That is angiotensin II. And remember, the purpose of angiotensin II is to raise blood pressure. So angiotensin II stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone causes the nephron to have more sodium-potassium pumps. These pumps move sodium to the blood. And remember Mary and her lamb, the water follows the sodium. So now you have more water in your blood. And because there's more water, you now have increased blood volume. And if you look at your chart from chapter 20, you'll see that increased blood volume increases your blood pressure, which was the whole point of angiotensin II, to increase blood pressure. Of these three, the most important one is the potassium. And we'll go over this more in chapter 25, but just for now, we'll say that potassium is the most dangerous imbalance. If you have the wrong amount of potassium in your blood, if it goes out of homeostasis, you will have cardiac arrest. So the adrenal cortex gland and aldosterone are very important for keeping your blood potassium level in homeostasis, because you need to keep your blood potassium level just right in order to keep your heart beating. And that will be explained more in chapter 25.